stay after a little bit after services, so that way we can get to know you. You can get to know us better as well. Also, if you are visiting with us, in the pew in front of you, there are visitor cards. And if it's not in front of you, then there's probably one on the other side or probably behind you. But if you will, grab one of those, fill those out, and when the time comes, as the collection plate comes around, put those in there, so that way we have a record of your attendance and know that you were with us this morning. What a blessing it is to be here today. I was traveling this week, and as much as I enjoyed getting to see friends of mine and got to spend some time with other Christians in another part. I was in Ohio. It was awesome, but what a blessing it is to be back home. I honestly, as much as I love that no matter where I go, if the church is there, you hear me say this a lot, and I know it sounds cliched, but it's so true. No matter where I go, man, the church is there. And what a blessing it is. I felt at home there, and what a blessing it is to be back at home here with my brothers and sisters, with my family. What a blessing it is to be back home. I also want to be mindful of those who are traveling as well this week, next week, those who will be traveling abroad. Some of us are going to be going to camp this next week, so we want to be keeping mind of those who are traveling this summer in prayer as well. I was thinking this week about some things that in my own personal life have interrupted the way things have kind of been planned, the flow of things. Have you ever had something in your life that just kind of disrupted it, interrupted it? And what I mean by that, sometimes that could be a negative thing, sometimes that could be a positive thing, right? Like the loss of a family member, that changes things, doesn't it? Maybe a different family situation, maybe moving, things like that. Some things do have some sort of change in your life that you really can't go back to the way things were before. And then there are other things that kind of just interrupt your life. And whenever we use that word interruption, we oftentimes think of it negatively. So I'm not saying this, but for example, meeting Kelsey, that interrupted the way things had planned. And that wasn't a bad thing. You get what I mean? That wasn't a negative thing. Some things happen that, you think that life was going to happen this way, and then you meet someone or you move somewhere and things happen. And it's like, man, that's the way God had it planned all along, though. And it's so much better than what I intended. Maybe you can relate with the same thing. Maybe the birth of a child kind of changes things, right? Not there yet. I have a dog, though. That kind of changed things. But I'm not there yet with the children. But if you've had some big life change, and I also forgot my cat. She's often forgotten. But anyway, some things happen in our lives that change things. Some things happen in our lives that can affect it and impact it forever, right? That just happens. That happens. As long as you live, there are going to be those things that occur in your life. I think about the apostles. I think about the disciples of Jesus and when they encountered him. I think about when they first met Jesus. I think about when Jesus saw them and he says, "Follow me." And let me tell you something, their lives changed forever. And when you come in contact with Jesus, or if you've come in contact with Jesus, let me tell you, if you're a Christian, your life should have been changed forever, right? It should not be the way it was before. And if you are not a Christian this morning and you're wondering, how can I break out of this routine? How can I break away from this life of just that's filled with tragedy, that's filled with trial, that's filled with all these things? How can I break away from that and have someone who's going to help me endure it all? How can I come in contact with Jesus as well? When we look at this, if you have your Bibles with you, let's turn in our Bibles to Matthew chapter 4. We're going to begin reading in verse 18. Matthew chapter 4 and verse 18 through 22. And it was already read to us, but I want to read through it again as we break it down slowly. Matthew chapter 4, verse 18 through 22. Jesus' apostles had different occupations. They were tax collectors. We're going to be looking at some fishermen. They were individuals who were zealots. You think about Paul later on, a later apostle of Jesus who was a tent maker, and so on and so forth. The church is just filled, even today, right? Even in this very congregation, people of different walks of life, but all of us had our lives changed. If you're a Christian, your life should be different than the way it was before. And we look at these men that we're going to be reading about today, these fishermen. Men who lived in Galilee, who had a normal occupation, who were just doing their job that day, who were just doing what was normal, but something changed. Something happened. And let's go ahead and take a look at that, if you will. Let's begin reading in Matthew chapter 4, beginning in verse 18. And in Matthew chapter 4, beginning in verse 18, it says, while walking by the Sea of Galilee. Now, just to keep in mind, Jesus has begun his ministry. He's around the region of Capernaum. Capernaum wasn't a very big part of, it wasn't a very big region. It wasn't. So more than likely, these disciples that we're going to read of, they have already heard of Jesus. They've heard of what he's been doing. As a matter of fact, some scholars believe at this point, if you look at all the gospel accounts together, I think it's very easy to look at this and be like, wait, hold on a second. John says that they met Jesus differently, but when you actually when you harmonize the Gospels, a lot of scholars believe that they had already met Jesus prior to, as we read in the book of John, you remember Andrew. Andrew's all excited, and he goes to his brother Peter, and he's like, I've met the Messiah. And a lot of scholars believe that up to this point, a year has passed. A year has taken place. So we keep reading. While walking by the Sea of Galilee, he saw two brothers, Simon, who is called Peter, and Andrew, his brother. They're casting a net into the sea, which is this circular casting net, somewhere between 15 to 25 feet, and it had these weights, these lead weights at the very edges of it. So that way, when they cast it into the sea, it would envelop upon the fish as it would sink. So that way, they would catch a big haul. These were commercial fishermen. More than likely, these two gentlemen, they were brothers, obviously, but more than likely they had taken on the trade of their father, their grandfather, a trade that wasn't guaranteed, you weren't guaranteed to become wealthy from. You get what I'm saying? Most of your days were spent going to market. A lot of times you were fixing your boat. A lot of investment was made into this trade. You spent more probably than what you actually obtained. A lot of fishermen were actually peasants. Their families, at least in the Roman-ruled Judean society, a lot of these fishermen were poor. And a lot of their nights were spent away from their family fishing. The reason why they would fish at night was because the sea was a lot cooler and the fish would come to surface, so it was easier to catch them as opposed to the day. They would also fish along the shore. We often think of them out in the middle of the sea, just out there, but they would actually skim along the side of the shore to be able to catch the fish that were closer. And so when we think about that, when we think about these fishermen, this occupation, this was something in which they had been doing their whole lives. This was something, like I said, that didn't guarantee wealth. It didn't. As a matter of fact, it guaranteed that you probably would spend more than you would make, but whenever you did make something, it was something to be celebrated about. But then the next day you went back out there, or the next night you went back out there, and the day you were mending your nets. So this is where Jesus finds them. You know, Jesus, they're walking, they're casting their net into the sea, for they were fishermen. And he said to them, notice something, he said to them, follow me. Now this is key. Jesus says, follow me. Now, I want us to understand something in the relationship of a rabbi and their disciples around this time in Judaism. In the relationship, typically, if you were somebody who wanted to become a disciple of somebody, you would seek them out. You would try to find them. You would try to, you saw a particular rabbi. Jesus more than likely was well known, and at this point, and had a very good reputation. He was already preaching in synagogues, and if you had a bad reputation at this point, they wouldn't allow you to teach in the synagogue. So more than likely, Jesus was a respected rabbi. A rabbi viewed as one that was knowledgeable in the law, but one that was doing things a little bit differently. Things differently than what they were used to as far as culturally. Because oftentimes, like I said, if you were a disciple, you'd seek out a rabbi, and you would find this rabbi, and you would try to emulate everything about this rabbi. You would try to emulate everything from how he interpreted the Torah, to how he would read the Torah, yes, even inflections in the way he would preach. I think about when I was in preaching school, and a lot of times, if you hear the way I preach now, and if I showed you sermons from when I was in preaching school, I sounded like my instructors. That's what you do. You tend to kind of emulate somewhat the things that you're around. And so they would try to imitate their rabbis in everything. As a matter of fact, the expression, you've heard me talk about this, that, if a disciple was so close to their rabbi, then the rabbi's dust would be on them. You got to remember, this is a very dusty environment, right? This is in a part of the world where they're kicking up dust as they're walking. And it's almost like saying, you follow behind your rabbi so closely that the dust that he's kicking up behind him is getting all over you. That's how closely you stuck to your rabbi. As a matter of fact, it wasn't uncommon to see just a train of you have a rabbi and his disciples just following them very closely, just listening, talking amongst each other, just watching everything he does, from the way he eats, from the way he reads, from the way he converses with people. You try to emulate everything. And yet what Jesus is implementing here is very different. A lot of times what would happen was you may have imitated everything from your rabbi, but you never really developed a relationship with him. You get what I mean? In other words, you may have learned everything, and you more than likely developed a relationship with your fellow disciples. They were called talmidim. You developed the relationships with them, but your rabbi was kind of like this untouchable person that, you learned from him, and that was about it. But Jesus is starting up something different. He's saying, look, I want you to follow me, and I want this to be different than anything else that you have ever experienced before. This is not just some mere apprenticeship. You get what I'm saying? This isn't just some mere, you guys are going to follow me, and then you guys are going to, try to act like me. No, this is going to be completely life-changing. As a matter of fact, this is what he says to them. He says, follow me, and I will make you what? I will make you fishers of men. In other words, you follow me, you take on a new occupation. And everything else in your life before, it becomes changed because of following me. You follow me, and right now you're out there, you're fishing for fish. That's what you do. That's normal for fishermen to do. But you follow me, I will make you something new. I will make you different. I'm going to give you a greater responsibility. I'm going to give you a greater role. I'm going to make you fishers of men. Now, we look at this and we keep reading, and it says, immediately, what do? Immediately in verse 20, they left their nets and they followed him. You got to remember this. Their nets were their livelihood, right? I mean, it'd be like a barber leaving behind his clippers or a painter leaving behind her brushes. This was not just only their livelihood, but they had made fishing. Like I said, it was a time-consuming job. It wasn't hobby fishing. These were individuals that this is what they did for a living. This is what they did. Their lives depended on it. And just as I've talked about before in previous studies, in this culture, you weren't always guaranteed that you and your family were going to eat that night. You get what I'm saying? It was a different culture. You didn't have benefits. You didn't have things like that. As a matter of fact, even as far as back then, under the Roman Empire, you actually, believe it or not, had to have a fishing license. And if you couldn't secure that, and if you didn't always have the money to pay for it, and a lot of times they'd hike it up because it was dependent on whoever was in control of that, then you didn't fish, and that meant that you lost your livelihood. And Jesus says to them, he's like, follow me, and what do? Immediately, they leave behind the thing that has been their life, that has been their family's life, that has been their generations prior. They left all those things behind. They dropped their nets. Let me tell you, you see fishermen fishing, that's normal, right? That's what fishermen do. That's what they're supposed to do. Like you see horses eating grass, like you see, and so on and so forth. It's just normal. Nobody questions that. It's not strange. Fishermen dropping their nets, that's weird. That's different. That's not normal. Fishermen leaving behind their nets, something impacted them that immediately they had to do this. Now, just as I had said before, many scholars believe that a year has passed since these disciples actually first met Jesus. Think about in John chapter 1, verse 34 through the rest of the section, I believe through verse 40. Like I said, Andrew, he introduces Peter. This is like their first meetup with Jesus. Most scholars believe a year has passed. So more than likely, a year has passed since they first began following Jesus. We're not really told what exactly brought them back to fishing. We don't know. We don't know why they went back to fishing. But Jesus comes to them, and immediately they drop their nets. So this wasn't just something emotional. It wasn't just something that they were just like, it feels right, so we have to do it. More than likely, they have had enough time and they've heard the teachings. They've had enough time to actually contemplate, is this what we want to do? Because this is different than anything else. This isn't just I can continue living my life the way I want it and try to follow him. No, my life is going to be completely consumed by what he has in store for me. And we look at that and we're like, why would Jesus tell them to leave why would Jesus do all that? This is something that they chose to do, for one. But also, you got to keep this in mind. You have to keep in mind the fact that whatever they did prior to following Jesus, when they would return to it, they'd be better at it. Whether they were a father, whether they were, whether they had friends, whatever they were prior to having Jesus. Like, for example, you and I, there are a lot of things that when we become Christians, we still have friends, right? We still have family, we still have our jobs, but things are different. Things are different. You don't view those people the way you did before. You don't view the way you work or how you work the way you did before. Things change. And Jesus said, look, before you can go back and fix all those things, before you can take care of those things, you first must follow me. So they dropped their nets. And they followed him. We keep reading in verse 21. And going on from there, he saw two other brothers, James, the son of Zebedee, and John, his brother, in the boat with Zebedee, their father. Now, more than likely, Peter and Andrew were peasant fishermen, meaning that they were more than likely what we were talking about earlier, poor fishermen. But you read this in other gospel accounts, John and his brother James and their father Zebedee, they were different. They weren't peasant fishermen. They were more than likely fishermen that actually made a profit off of what they did. So much so that they had servants with them. In another gospel account, it talks about their servants that were with them, helping them mend their nets and helping them in their boat. And so more than likely, these individuals, this was a lucrative business for them. This was something in which their family, it's been a family business, and now they find Jesus. Jesus finds them, and what do? Immediately, verse 22, immediately they left the boat and their father, and they followed him. They left behind their family business. They left behind, can you imagine people, are you crazy? That's your livelihood. Are you crazy? You're going to upset your father. Are you crazy? Why are you doing that? To follow him? But they couldn't help it. There was something about Jesus that they couldn't, after meeting Jesus, they couldn't just go back to fishing. They couldn't just go back to mending their nets. They couldn't go back to the way things were before. There was something about Jesus. You got to remember, at this point in time, people had been waiting for the Messiah. The Messiah has come. Remember we talked about that last week about, Joseph, his father, and the excitement that everyone experienced. We talked about Anna, the prophetess, in Luke chapter 2, weeks prior to that, just about all these people who at this point, you read Luke chapter 2, it talks about these people who were so excited about the coming of Jesus, and now he's here. And the Messiah is there. The most important thing in their life that they valued so highly, the coming of the Messiah, the coming of God's anointed one, the one who's supposed to save us, Emmanuel, Yeshua, the Messiah, the one who's supposed to redeem us and free us and make our lives better, the one who's supposed to help us see the way God has always intended for us to live. He's here. How can I just go back and act like everything is normal? Oh, yeah, the Messiah's here. Go back to fishing. They couldn't do that. The Messiah, the greatest being, you got to remember, all throughout the scriptures, the Messiah, the concept of Messiah, the concept of one who was going to come, the one who was going to help his people, is all throughout the scriptures. It's all throughout. You read in Isaiah, you read as far back as Genesis, you read in Deuteronomy, you read David's writings, and so on and so forth. All throughout the scriptures, this individual, they have been waiting for and waiting for and waiting for, and now he's come, and how could they go back and act like, well, this is nothing, this is just normal? They couldn't. That's the impact that Jesus had in their lives. And when we think about all this, when we think about what Jesus, for his disciples, like I said, fishing for fishermen, that's normal. There's nothing strange about that. They were fishermen. That's what they do. That's normal. But what does Jesus say to them? He tells them, follow him, and what do? They drop their nets and leave their nets. Now, that's not what fishermen do. That's not normal. When Jesus said, follow me, they left and followed him, and their lives were never the same again. You think about this, man. I always wonder, reading like Peter's writings about 30 years after all this, reading the Acts account of the history of the church, Peter, specifically thinking about Peter and his life, because we read about Peter so much as far as the other apostles are concerned, the other disciples of Jesus. I think about his own life, and I always wonder, later on, 30 years later, he's like, man, if Jesus, the Messiah, would have never come into my life, I'd still be fishing. But now think about what I'm doing. I'm a part of the greatest family the world has ever known, and I have the greatest calling to be a disciple of Jesus. That's far greater than being a fisherman. I always wonder, Andrew himself, man, I'm so glad that I saw Jesus and I ran to my brother and I told him, think about all the people that were saved because these 12 men decided we're leaving behind everything to follow him. Think about all the people that came in contact with the gospel of Jesus because these men said, following him is more important than fishing. Think about all the people whose lives would be shaped forever because these men, their lives were shaped forever. If we think about that, When we think about some other passage of Scripture, I was reminded when I thought about this of what Isaiah the prophet, when God called him to be a prophet to the nation, he said to God, earlier on, God tells, he's in the throne room of God in Isaiah chapter 6, and he's seeing this magnificent being, this God who is awesome, and he's afraid, he's scared, and he says, it's because I'm unholy, I'm unclean, and God purifies him, and then God says, and I heard the voice of the Lord saying, whom shall I send, and who will go for us? And Isaiah said, here am I, send me. I think about Jesus himself. Jesus talks about discipleship heavily all throughout the gospel accounts. And in John chapter 8, if you have your Bibles, let's look there in John chapter 8. And in John's gospel account, in John chapter 8, we read in verse 31 through 32, John chapter 8, verse 31 through 32, and it reads, so Jesus said to the Jews who had believed in him, if you abide in my word, you are truly my disciples, and you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. In other words, if you have followed the teachings, not just know them front to back, not just practicing them, but they've changed your life, you are truly my disciples. As a matter of fact, in John chapter 13, verse 34 through 35, Jesus even tells his disciples, they will know you are my disciples indeed if you have love for one another. Discipleship is something that's so visible because these people could not go back living the way they were before. Their lives were forever transformed. As I had said earlier, there are things in our life that completely change everything. They completely interrupt the way our lives are. You think about the death of a loved one, loss of a job. That changes things, right? The loss of a job, change of living situation, family changes, and you can begin to learn and find what people call a new normal. You know what I mean? Like, this is my new normal. Like, it's different than what my old normal was, but this is my new normal, but you can never go back. There are things that just happen in life that you can never go back to the way things were before, in many cases, right? Even positive things can have that impact on our lives. Just as I was saying earlier, marriage, birth of a child, maybe job promotion, things like that. Even positive things have that impact. When Jesus came to earth, he permanently disrupted everything. I want you to think about that. When Jesus came to earth, he permanently disrupted everything. And when he says to you, when he says to me, follow me, and you truly realize, that's the thing, I want us to understand this. When you truly realize that Jesus is the Messiah, when you truly realize that Jesus is the one in whom we have been waiting for, the one in whom generations have waited for, Jesus is the one who is God. Jesus is the one who is our saving Redeemer. When you truly realize that he is resurrected and he is a Savior who is extending out his hand to you, how can you and I even try to go back to the way things were or pretend that Jesus is coming and saving humanity is just something normal? How can you and I just come to church, sing songs, pray prayers, and then leave here like nothing happened? You get what I'm saying? How can we just go through this life and act as if all this that we're doing here today is normal? This is not normal. This is something amazing. This is something awesome. And this is something that is above. You got to remember, God is holy, right? And the life that he calls us to live is holiness. We've been talking about in our Leviticus class. I want to thank Gerald for covering that class this past week. Heard he did an awesome job doing that, kind of refreshing our thoughts on this concept of holiness, on this concept of who God is. The concept of holiness means God is here and everything else is beneath. In other words, God is set apart from everything. God is not normal. God is not average. God is above all those things. And he calls for you and I to live the same way. The things in which we once considered this was the way my life was have changed because of Jesus. What were the early church, what were they known as? They were called peculiar people, right? If you knew somebody for a long time and you're like, man, I know the way this person lived. I know how he used to be. But man, when he came in contact with Jesus, he's a different person. Yeah, he still has flaws, he still has weaknesses, but he allows for somebody greater than him to be his strength, to be a source of encouragement and comfort. And he can endure, she can endure, because their life has been changed forever by Jesus. When we think about our lives, how can we just worship? How can we just, like I said earlier, just sing and just do the things in which we think are what Christians are to do, which they are, but not leave here feeling impacted. Not leaving this building as if, well, I've already done my part. Or has our life been so interrupted in a positive way by Jesus that you don't see things the same way? You get what I mean? Have you been so impacted by Jesus that, man, you don't even spend money the way you used to, right? You think about things. You're like, man, I want to be a good steward. You don't even spend time the way you used to. You say to yourself, man, what am I going to do with my time? I could be teaching people. I could be helping people. I could be spending time with people and helping them grow. I could be spending more time in prayer and reading and things like that. You treat people differently. When you've really been impacted by Jesus, man, your life should be changed and is changed when you've really been impacted by Jesus forever. And that's the thing. I want us to understand something. The apostles, we read about 3.5 years of still making mistakes, still being human, right? I know it's easy to think like, man, they followed Jesus and it was all perfect from there on out. Keep reading the gospel accounts. Oh, they said things and they did things they shouldn't have done. They argued amongst each other. They competed with each other. They were very jealous. They struggled. They were human beings, but their lives would increasingly become better the closer they would come to Jesus. And man, the Peter that we read of later on in the book of Acts and the Peter that we first encounter here in the boat, it's almost like two different people. That's the way it should be. That's what Jesus does for us. You know, Peter, Andrew, James, and John's life was forever changed when following Jesus, and there was no possible way they could ever go back to life as normal. Neither can we ourselves. When we truly see him for who he is, there will be nets left behind. You get what I mean? When we truly see Jesus for who he is, when we truly see him as the Savior, as the Messiah, as the great one, as the loving one, as the one who died for us and wants us to serve him and serve others, when we truly see that, there are nets in our lives that we drop too. We begin to realize, man, I can't go back to that. Or that thing that in my life may not necessarily be a bad thing, but man, this is so much more important. And this should take up more of my time. And this should take up more of what I do because, man, my life has been changed forever for the better. It's so easy to allow for Christianity to just become a normal part of our life. And what I mean by that is, I mean, in some, yeah, it is, but at the same time, it's so easy to forget that what we have in our life is so special and so important. And do we value it the way we value everything else in our life at times? Do we see the salvation that we have as, man, this is the greatest thing that has ever happened in my life, and I want to teach it to others. That's what Jesus said, right? When he told his disciples when he resurrected and they were on the seashore, he says, go therefore and make disciples. The same thing that happened to you, go forth and do the same for others. Go forth and show people, man, I was a fisherman, I was a tax collector, I was a zealot, I was a tent maker, I was whatever, put your occupation there. This is what I was. This is what people identified me as. But now, because of Jesus, I have something more. And you can too. Let me tell you, whatever your occupation may be, whatever your status in life may be, you are not just, let's say you're a lawyer, you're not just a lawyer who happens to be a Christian, you're a Christian lawyer. I know it's easy to think about, as a preacher, well, that's kind of weird saying you're a Christian preacher, but man, there are a lot of people who proclaim but are not necessarily living their lives right. You get what I mean? They're not necessarily following and not necessarily being a disciple of Jesus. The same thing goes for me. You're not just what people think you are or what you think you are. When you have Jesus in your life, you become something more. That's what the word Christian means. It means follower of Christ, and I've taken his name upon my name. I'm no longer just Paul. I'm a Christian. And that's the greatest aspect of my life. And there is nothing, when I become a Christian, that I can do that could ever just go back to normal. I can't. It just makes no sense. Discipleship isn't just, though, about what you lose or give up. I know we talk about that a lot. Jesus says, unless you, deny yourself and take up the cross, you can't follow me, and so on and so forth. But discipleship isn't just about what you lose or give up. It's ultimately about what you truly gain. I want you to think about that for a second. It's easy to just talk about, here's the things that you leave behind. But man, when they left behind their nets, Jesus wasn't just like, all right, that's it. They gained something. They gained a new role. They gained a new life. They gained blessings. They gained encouragement. They gained a relationship with the Savior. They gained so much because of what they were willing to leave behind and because of who they were willing to follow. If you're here this morning and you're looking at your own personal life and you're saying to yourself, man, I call myself a Christian, but I don't feel like I'm really following Jesus. I know I do the things that it seems like Christians should do, but I struggle following him. Man, maybe there are some nets that you need to leave behind. Maybe there are some nets that you need to drop. Maybe there are some things in your life that you need to look at and say, I don't need this anymore. This is just weighing me down. I need to follow him. Man, when you do that, your life becomes so much better. Your life becomes the way God always intended it for it to be, for us to have. Your life becomes shaped into the image of him. And man, that is awesome. If you're here this morning and if you're not a Christian, and Jesus has this life set up for you that he says, man, if you follow after me, remember what he says, for in my Father's house there are many mansions, man. If you follow after me, you will have blessings beyond what you could possibly imagine within this lifetime as well as in the next. But you got to be willing to follow him and truly be a disciple of Jesus. Jesus says, follow me. Can you just go back to normal after hearing that? After hearing this sermon this morning, can you view Christianity, what we do here week after week in your own life, as just the same as it always has been? Or will you and I decide, I'm going to truly follow after him and see things the way he's always intended for them to be seen? If you're here this morning, I want to encourage you, if there's anything that we can help you with at this time, to come forward as together we stand and as we sing.